The fluorescent lights above the Apex Racing engineering bay hummed a low electric note, washing the concrete floor in pale blue. At the center of that cold light sat a car that had broken 3 senior engineers across 11 sleepless days, with the biggest race of the year closing in fast. Daniel Holt stepped quietly across the yellow tape, stenciled "Engineers Only." Calloused hands, no badge, no hesitation. A single father who had tucked his 6-year-old daughter into bed only hours before he laid his palm flat on the engine block, the way a doctor rests a hand on a sleeping chest, listening for something the others had missed. By morning, the bay breathed in a way it had not breathed in years. By the time the sun rose over Indianapolis, Catherine Sloan had already made the most expensive mistake of her life. Long before the morning, Catherine Sloan would come to regret the basement of Apex Racing kept its own quiet rhythm. The ventilation pipes ran fat and silver across a low ceiling. The concrete floor carried oil stains from another decade, and the man whose name sat on the 3rd tier of the building maintenance roster moved through that quiet, like someone who had walked it long before anyone thought to paint a yellow line above his head. Daniel Holt had been on the payroll for 3 months, his badge clipped to a worn leather belt, and read, Tier 3 Maintenance. The job paid $16 an hour. It came with a gray uniform that smelled faintly of industrial soap, no matter how many washings he gave it, and with a small apartment across town where his 6-year-old daughter slept beneath a blanket printed with cartoon planets. Lily knew her father fixed broken things at a big building far away. She did not know the building had once been built around her father's hands. Apex Racing rose 17 stories of glass and pale stone over the gray boulevards of Indianapolis. $2 billion of carbon fiber and combustion engineering wrapped in the name of a man who had been buried 14 months ago. Gerald Sloan had died of pancreatic cancer, the way he had built his company quickly, decisively, and a little too late for anyone to do much about it. He left behind a daughter of 28, a board of directors who had loved him, and a chief operating officer who had served him for the better part of 2 decades and never quite been told he was the second favorite child. Marcus Webb wore his 52 years well. Tailored Navy suits, a silver pin shaped like a camshaft on his lapel, the kind of measured warmth that filled a conference room before he opened his mouth. After Gerald's funeral, he had appeared at Catherine's elbow, at every meeting, every announcement, every quiet dinner, with old investors, his hand resting just above her shoulder, like a man holding open a door she had not yet decided to walk through. He had personally approved the maintenance hire of one Daniel Holt 3 months earlier, without comment, without question, and without anyone in human resources thinking to ask why. Up in the test bay on the 4th floor behind walls of soundproofed glass, a young man named Tyler Reeves was laughing about something with 2 of the pit crew. He was 24. He still wore the polo shirt the marketing team had sent him from the announcement shoot. His first race contract sat folded in the inside pocket of his jacket, signed in a green room 2 weeks earlier, and he kept touching it the way another man might touch a wedding ring he was not yet used to wearing. Through the glass from a maintenance corridor 1 floor down, Daniel watched him for a long moment. Something in the way Tyler stood chin up, weight shifted forward, ready to be loved by everyone in the room, opened a small, old ache under his ribs. He had stood like that once in this same building a lifetime ago. 6 months back in the unfinished living room of his apartment, Daniel had been folding laundry when a sports recap on the muted television showed Apex Racing announcing its new driver lineup for the upcoming season. The name had meant nothing to him. The car behind the kid parked on the press platform with its hood up for the cameras had meant everything. He had set the laundry down, walked to the kitchen drawer, and opened the bottom file of papers he had not touched in years. The carbon copy of the letter was still there. He had mailed the original 1.5 years earlier, registered return receipt to Gerald Sloan personally. The receipt had come back signed by an assistant. The letter itself had never been answered. That night, after Lily was asleep, he had searched the name Gerald Sloan on his laptop. The first 3 results were obituaries. The 4th was a memorial fund. He read until the screen blurred, and then he read again. And somewhere around the second pass, he understood that the man he had trusted to put a small critical correction into the official RS7 schematics had died without ever opening his envelope. He filed his application the following week under his own name, with a resume thin enough to slide under a door. The morning the trouble began, the air inside the upper engineering bay was sour with 11 days of failed diagnostics. The RS7, the car that had carried Apex onto every magazine cover for the last decade, the car the licensing department politely called the asset, had begun to misfire in a way that did not appear in any service manual. The fuel injection system pulsed cleanly on the bench, then collapsed under load. 3 senior engineers had stripped the assembly to its housing and put it back together twice. 2 consultants flown in from Detroit had walked the bay for an afternoon, conferred in low voices by the coffee machine, and flown home with their billing sheets and no answers. Marcus called the emergency meeting for 9 on Tuesday morning. The senior staff filed into the glass conference room on the 14th floor with the kind of expressions men wear at funerals they cannot afford to attend. Marcus laid out 2 options in the patient fatherly voice he had perfected over the past 14 months: withdraw from the race or substitute the backup chassis. Both bled money. Both bled reputation. Neither he allowed himself a small sigh as he said it was acceptable. Then he set a slim leather folder on the table and slid it gently across the surface toward Catherine. A third option, he said. Detroit had been making inquiries for some time. A licensing transfer of the RS7 platform executed cleanly this week, before any rumor of the technical failure reached the wrong ears, would bring in 9 figures of capital and put the headache somewhere else entirely. The contracts, he added, were already drafted. He had taken the liberty. Catherine looked at the folder for a long moment. She did not open it. She did not ask why he had taken the liberty without telling her. She only folded her hands on the table and said very quietly that none of those were options. 2 floors below, in a maintenance crawl space where the building's main ventilation column came down through the basement ceiling, Daniel Holt stood with his back against the cold metal duct and listened. He heard every word. He heard Marcus talk about the Detroit deal as if it had not been 3 years in the making. He heard Catherine's voice harden into something her father's old engineers would have recognized. He heard the chair scrape and the meeting break. When the room above him had gone silent, he spoke once almost to himself, to the dust and the pipes and no one else. Secondary pressure valve. The gasket. They've never read the original blueprints. He went home that evening and read his daughter a book about a small bear who had lost his hat. Lily, lying with her cheek on his arm, asked him without warning whether he missed her mother. The question came the way her questions always came, without preamble, in the tone of a child who had decided the answer would be true regardless. He told her he missed her every day. She thought about that for a while, then turned the page herself and asked him to keep reading. After she was asleep, he cleared the kitchen table. He spread 3 sheets of butcher paper across the surface and weighted the corners with a coffee mug, a salt shaker, and the wooden duck Lily had painted at school. Then, with a mechanical pencil he had owned for a decade, he began to draw. He did not draw from a reference. There was no reference. He drew the way a pianist plays a piece he has not performed in years, the hands knowing the shape of the thing before the mind catches up. By 11, he had the fuel injection assembly to scale. By midnight, he had the secondary pressure valve broken out in 3 views. His hands did not shake. They had never shaken when he drew. At 1:45 in the morning, he picked up his keys. The drive across town was empty. The yellow tape stenciled "Engineers Only" across the upper bay door had been there since Marcus had ordered it strung up during the 2nd day of the diagnostic failure. The tape was a courtesy notice, not a lock. Daniel stepped over it without slowing his stride, the side maintenance door behind him, swinging shut on the same brass key he had carried in a coffee tin in his kitchen drawer for 10 years. The flashback came on him as he opened his tool roll. He was 24 again in this same building, leaning over a draft table, with a man twice his age who smelled of pipe tobacco and black coffee. Kid Gerald had said, tapping the gasket detail with the eraser end of a pencil, "If we don't put this into the official documents 10 years from now, somebody dies because of it." "So put it in," Daniel had answered. Gerald had laughed the laugh of a man already 3 steps ahead. "I'll handle that part. You just design." Standing now over the engine that had broken 3 of Gerald's best engineers, Daniel set both palms flat on the cool aluminum cowling and closed his eyes for a moment. He had told Lily once, when she had asked him what he did for a living, that some machines spoke if you held still long enough. He held still now. Under his right hand, beneath the housing, he could feel where the load wanted to travel and where it had been forced to detour. The car was telling him in the only language it had, exactly what was missing. He reached into the tool roll and lifted out a small machined ring no larger than a wedding band. He had turned it himself a decade ago on a lathe 2 floors above where he now stood. It had never been cataloged. It had never been entered into the parts inventory. It existed nowhere in the official record of Apex Racing, only in his hands and in the memory of one dead man. He bent over the engine and he began to work. By 6:47 in the morning, the engine of the RS-7 fired clean. The sound was not the rough, half-correct cough that had filled the bay for the last 11 days. It was the long, even note of an instrument that had finally remembered what it was. Daniel rolled his toolkit closed, wiped his hands on a shop rag, and walked back through the upper bay with the unhurried gait of a man who was already late to start his actual shift 2 floors below. He did not look up at the cameras. He did not need to. In the glass-walled foreman's office that overlooked the main floor, Ray Halloran had been watching for an hour. He was 61 years old, with hands that had repaired engines for Apex since the first chassis rolled out of a rented warehouse, and a face that had learned a long time ago how to keep its own counsel. When Daniel passed beneath his window, Ray set down his coffee mug and gave a single slow nod through the glass. Daniel did not break stride. He returned the nod with one of his own just as small and disappeared down the stairwell to the basement. Neither man said a word. By 7:15, Nathan Pierce was in the bay with 2 diagnostic technicians and a clipboard he kept forgetting to write on. Nathan was 35, the chief engineer on the RS-7 program, and he had not slept more than 4 hours a night in 11 days. He ran the full test cycle twice. The numbers came back cleaner than the factory tolerances, cleaner than the original commissioning sheets from a decade ago. He stood with his hand on the engine cowling and stared at the readout the way a man stares at a sentence in a language he does not speak. He asked the technicians very carefully whether anyone had been in the bay overnight. The technicians looked at each other and said no. Nathan walked the floor for 10 minutes, found nothing out of place, and finally went up to the 14th floor to tell Marcus that the car was against every available explanation fixed. Marcus had already seen the camera feed. He had come in at 5:40 in the morning, a habit he had cultivated since Gerald's death, and the night supervisor had flagged the motion alert from the upper bay without flagging the face, because the face had not pinged any of the building's executive recognition profiles. Marcus watched the playback alone in his office. He watched a man in a gray maintenance uniform step over the yellow tape. He watched the man unroll a toolkit. He watched a small, machined ring come out of a felt pocket and disappear into the engine. He did not recognize Daniel by his face. The face had thinned in 10 years, hardened around the eyes. He recognized him by the hands. The way the right thumb braced under the wrench, the way the left palm flattened on the cowling before any tool came near the metal. Marcus had stood across draft tables from those hands for 3 years. He would have known them in the dark. He sat at his desk for a long time after the playback ended. Then he opened the security console, isolated the relevant segment, and edited the timestamps. He clipped the diagnostic readout from the morning's automated log. He pulled the entry record from the badge system and replaced it with a blank. By the time Nathan's email reached him at 7:40, Marcus had already drafted the memo he would carry into Catherine's office. Catherine read it standing at the window of the corner office on the 15th floor, the office that had been her father's for 30 years, and which she still entered as if she were borrowing it. The memo was 3 paragraphs long, written in the dry procedural language Marcus reserved for matters he wanted, handled quickly. Unauthorized personnel, restricted area, tampering with critical race assets. Recommend immediate termination citing breach of safety protocol. She set the page on the desk. The Detroit folder Marcus had slid across the conference table the day before still sat where she had left it unopened. The intercom buzzed. Marcus was already on his way up. He came in with 2 pieces of paper in one hand, and the camera still on a tablet in the other. He laid out the situation the way a doctor lays out a diagnosis he has already decided upon. A maintenance employee had crossed into the upper bay without authorization. He had handled the RS-7. The car had subsequently registered changes in its fuel injection system that no one in the engineering department could account for. If Detroit caught wind of an unvetted hand on the asset, the licensing deal would collapse before it reached signature. Catherine asked quietly whether the car was running. Marcus said the car was running. That was in fact the problem. She told him to bring the man up. Daniel stepped into the office still wearing the gray uniform. He did not look at the photograph of Gerald on the credenza. He did not look at the Detroit folder. He looked at Catherine. She asked him in a voice that was steady and not unkind whether he could explain what he had done. "The car is running now," he said. Marcus took a half step forward. He asked Daniel whether he carried any technical certifications relevant to the RS-7 platform, whether anyone anywhere in the building had authorized him to so much as touch a panel on that car. Daniel did not look at him. He kept his eyes on Catherine. "Do you want the car to run?" he asked her. "Or do you want the paperwork to be correct?" The question hung in the room in a way that startled all 3 of them. Marcus moved first. He laid his hand very lightly on the back of Catherine's chair. It was the gesture of a man who believed without ever having been told, so that he owned the decision before it was made. Catherine's eyes went down to the desk, then up again. The Detroit folder was still on the corner of the blotter, and her father's pen was still in the holder, and the man in front of her was still waiting. She signed the termination order. Daniel buttoned the top button of his uniform jacket slowly, without taking his eyes from her face. When he spoke again, his voice was almost gentle. "Before the race this weekend," he said, "read the original blueprints of the RS-7, not the current revision. The original, if the company still has them." He turned and walked out. The door closed behind him with the soft, padded click of expensive hardware. Marcus exhaled, smoothed the front of his suit, and began to thank her for handling it cleanly. Catherine did not seem to hear him. She was looking at the closed door. She told him after a moment that she would call when she needed him. Marcus left. She sat alone in her father's office for a long time. Then she picked up the phone and dialed the security desk in the basement and asked them to send her the unedited camera footage from the upper bay between 2 and 4 o'clock that morning. The whole feed. Nothing trimmed. 15 minutes later, a message from Marcus appeared in her inbox. The subject line read, "Last night's footage." The body was 2 sentences long, written in the same patient fatherly tone he always used. The relevant files had already been archived under standard procedure. He would have them decoded and forwarded to her by the end of next week. She read the message twice. Then she set the phone down on her father's desk and looked at it for a while without picking it up again. That evening, after the last of the staff had left the executive floor, she walked down the hall to the office that had been Gerald's. She had not yet moved into it. The cleaning crew still came once a week and dusted the things she had not had the heart to box. The framed schematic of the very first Apex chassis hung where it had always hung. The pen cup held the same 5 mechanical pencils. The leather-bound notebook he had carried into every meeting for the last decade lay on the corner of the desk where the funeral home staff had returned it, along with his watch and his wedding ring. She opened the notebook to the last page he had written on. The entry was dated 3 weeks before the diagnosis. The handwriting was tight and slanted the way it always was when he was thinking faster than his pen could keep up. Most of the page was a list of meeting reminders and a half-finished thought about quarterly numbers. At the very bottom, underlined twice, Gerald had written, DH callback. Important. Beneath the initials, a phone number had been jotted and then crossed out hard in 3 angry strokes of black ink. She stood with the notebook open in her hands in the office, where her father had died, and she did not move for a long time. The race ran on Sunday. The RS-7 came in second. It was the best Apex result in 9 seasons. Tyler Reeves climbed onto the podium with champagne in his hair and the trophy raised over his head, and he laughed the broad, unguarded laugh of a young man who did not yet know what had almost happened to him. The crew lifted him onto their shoulders. Photographers shouted his name from 3 sides of the barricade. Catherine watched from the edge of the pit lane, with her hands buried in the pockets of her coat. The Indianapolis afternoon was bright and cold. Around her, people were embracing and crying and calling their families. She was thinking about a set of original blueprints she had not yet found, and a pair of initials in her father's notebook, and a man whose hands she had ordered out of the building 3 days earlier. She found Ray that evening in the workshop after the celebration had drained out of the building, and only the cleanup crew remained. The yellow lamps over the cold benches turned the metal warm and brown. He was sitting on a stool with a coffee in his hand, the way he had sat at the end of every working day for 30 years. He had been waiting for her. She could see that the moment she walked in. She asked him to tell her about a man named Daniel Holt. Ray took a long swallow of his coffee. Then he set the mug down on the bench, and he began to talk in the slow, measured voice of someone who had carried a story too long and had been hoping for years that someone would finally come and take it from him. 10 years ago, he said Gerald Sloan had found a 21-year-old kid on a self-taught engineering forum out of a small town in Ohio. No degree, no connections, just sketches he had been posting under a screen name. Sketches that had made Gerald sit up at his desk one Sunday afternoon and reach for the phone. Gerald had flown to Ohio himself. He had brought the kid back to Indianapolis the same week. In 4 years, that kid designed 7 engine variants for Apex racing. The 7th was the RS-7. It was the cleanest piece of mechanical thinking Gerald said he had ever seen in his life, and he had said so to the board, and he had said so to the press, and he had said so, most of all, to the man who had been his second in command for over a decade, and was still waiting for the chief engineering chair he believed had been promised to him. Gerald had told that man plainly in the hallway outside the design office one afternoon that he was the finest organizer Gerald had ever worked with. But you don't have what the kid has. Ray's voice flattened a little when he came to that part. He did not name the man. He did not have to. The kid stayed on through the launch year watching the RS-7 take its first season of trophies. Then his wife had died in a car accident on Interstate 70. Their daughter was barely walking. The kid had walked out of the building one Friday afternoon and had not come back. By Monday morning, the original signed blueprints of the RS-7 had disappeared from his draft table. Ray reached into the inside pocket of his work jacket and took out a brown leather wallet that had been folded the same way for so many years it had taken the shape of his hip. He opened it and lifted out with the careful fingertips of a man handling a relic, a single sheet of paper. It was a paper napkin yellowed at the edges from a diner that had closed in 2014. On its surface, drawn in pencil and now soft with age, was a load distribution sketch for what would later become the RS-7. In the lower right corner, 2 sets of initials had been signed side by side in the casual shorthand of 2 men who had known each other long enough not to need full names, GS and DH. He set the napkin on the bench between them and did not say anything else. Catherine left the workshop and went directly to the third-floor archive. She walked past the night security desk without acknowledging the guard. She unlocked the document cabinet at the end of the back row with the 4-digit code that was her mother's birthday. She had not opened it since the week of her father's funeral. In the second drawer behind a folder of insurance correspondence, she found an envelope addressed in a neat, careful handwriting to Gerald Sloan, personal. The return address was a post office box in a small town she had never heard of. The postmark was a year and a half old. The envelope had never been opened. She stood in the cold light of the archive and held the letter in her hands, and she understood with a clarity that closed over her like cold water that her father had died before he ever saw it. She read the letter twice, standing there beneath the archive's flickering ceiling lamp before she trusted herself to walk back upstairs. The handwriting was the same handwriting that had signed the napkin. The tone was careful, almost apologetic. It explained in language a layman could follow that during the original commissioning of the RS-7, a small machined gasket had been installed by hand into the secondary pressure valve and had never made it onto the official documentation. It noted without drama that any later iteration of the engine pushed past a certain load threshold without that gasket would fail catastrophically. It asked plainly that the writer be permitted to come back to the building even for an afternoon to enter the correction into the master file. It was signed Daniel Holt with a return number in case Gerald wished to call. Catherine carried the letter back to her father's office and laid it on the desk beside the leather notebook. She set the napkin from Ray's wallet next to both. Then she opened the bottom drawer of the credenza, where Gerald had kept the company's master engineering archive on a single locked drive, and she pulled the original RS-7 blueprint folder for the first time in her adult life. She compared them line by line under the desk lamp until the windows behind her went black. The gasket was there in the original, a small notation in Gerald's handwriting in the margin, an arrow pointing to the secondary pressure valve, 3 words, DH by hand. In every revision filed afterward and every print Apex had circulated through its engineering department. For the past decade, the notation was gone, the gasket was gone, the arrow was gone. The drawings had been redrafted under the in-house engineering letterhead. The original signature block scrubbed the IP filed under internal R&D development lead designer of record M. Webb. She sat with that for a long time. She thought about the Detroit folder still sitting on the corner of the conference table 3 floors up. She thought about a clause her own legal team had walked her through the previous week, a personal performance bonus written into the operating officer's portion of the licensing transfer. She had assumed when Marcus had shown it to her that it was standard. She remembered now that he had moved past it quickly. $14 million that clause was worth on signature. She thought about Tyler Reeves on the podium soaked in champagne, laughing. She picked up the phone. Marcus came up to the 15th floor at 9:15 the following morning. He had taken his time on the stairs. He arrived buttoning his cuff, the camshaft pin catching the light of the corner office, and he wore the small, patient smile of a man who had answered her summonses for 20 years. The smile faltered when he saw the desk. She had laid them out in a careful row across the blotter. The original RS-7 blueprint with the marginal note in Gerald's hand. The unopened letter slit cleanly across the top, now the pages fanned beside the envelope. 3 printed pages of internal email correspondence from a decade ago, the timestamps highlighted in yellow. The yellowed napkin from a diner that had closed in 2014 with 2 sets of initials in the lower right corner. Marcus took it in with the practiced steadiness of a man who had been preparing somewhere in the back of his mind for this exact tableau for 10 years. He sat down without being invited. He began the way he always began. He told her that he understood how things might appear from a certain angle. He told her that the company her father had built had been more complicated than any one person, including Gerald, had ever fully wanted to admit. He told her that decisions made under pressure in the wake of a tragedy did not always look the same in hindsight as they had looked in the moment. She did not interrupt him. He moved into the closing argument. He spoke about her, about how proud her father would have been, about how he had personally watched her grow into the chair she now occupied. He spoke about the burden of leadership and the uses of a steady hand. And then, leaning forward across the desk with the warmth of a man who had used that warmth as a working tool for 2 decades, he said it. "Sweetheart, your father always told me this company is run with the head, not with the heart." She cut him off. "He never called me sweetheart." The room went quiet around the 4 words. "He never called me kiddo or honey or any of those," she said. "Not once in 28 years. He used my name. And he never used yours when he meant mine. That's the part you never understood about him." Marcus's face did something it had not done in front of her before. It went still in the wrong way, the way a face goes still when its owner is no longer running the muscles from the inside. She told him in a voice she had practiced down the hallway that the licensing transfer to Detroit was being withdrawn from consideration, effective immediately, on the grounds that the underlying intellectual property had never been lawfully transferred to the corporate entity in the first place. She told him that the board would be receiving a full document package by close of business. She told him that he should consider the rest of the day his own. He did not argue. He stood smoothed the front of his suit out of habit and looked at the items on the desk one last time, the napkin perhaps the longest. Then he walked out of her father's office without speaking, and he did not close the door behind him. She closed it herself. She found Daniel's address in the personnel file the building had been keeping, under the wrong name for 3 months. The apartment was on the east side of Indianapolis, on the 2nd floor of a brick building, with a sycamore tree in the front yard, in a neighborhood where the houses still had aluminum mailboxes mounted by the front doors. She parked at the curb and sat in the car for a few minutes before she got out. The doorbell brought small, deliberate footsteps to the other side. The chain unlatched. The door opened the width of a cautious child. Lily was holding a stuffed bear by one arm. She wore pajamas printed with little blue gears and orange wrenches. She looked up at Catherine, the way a 6-year-old looks at someone she has been raised to be polite to and otherwise cautious of. "My dad's fixing my car," she announced. She turned and walked back into the apartment, leaving the door open behind her, and Catherine, after a moment, followed. The kitchen was small and neat. A pot of pasta water was warming on the back burner. At the round table beneath the window, Daniel sat with a tin toy car upside down in his lap, threading a new axle through the rear wheels. He had on a soft flannel shirt with the cuffs rolled up. He did not look surprised when Catherine appeared in the doorway. He looked more than anything tired, in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. He set the toy car down on the table. He nodded to the chair across from him. Lily, satisfied that her father was not in any visible distress, padded back into the small living room and resumed an arrangement of blocks on the rug. Catherine took the chair. From her bag, she lifted the envelope and laid it on the table between them. He looked at it for a long moment before he reached for it. He read the letter, the way he had drawn the blueprints 2 nights earlier, with hands that knew every word before his eyes finished tracing it. When he came to the bottom of the 2nd page, he set the letter down very carefully and pressed the heels of both hands against his eyes for a few seconds before he lowered them again. His eyes were red when he looked up. "He never read it," he said. "He didn't have time," she said. In the living room, Lily was singing tunelessly to her bear about a parade. They talked for a long time. She told him what she had found. The blueprints with his work scrubbed off and refiled under another man's signature. The licensing deal that would have walked the IP out of the building before anyone could prove its provenance. The $14 million clause buried 2/3 of the way into the operating officer's section. He listened without surprise, the way a man listens to the explanation of a fire he had smelled on the wind for years. She told him about the notebook and the crossed-out phone number and the words, DH callback. Important. That part was harder for him to hear. He looked out the kitchen window for a while at the sycamore tree, and he did not say anything for the length of time it took the pasta water to start humming on the burner. Then he reached over and turned the burner off. "I called him," he said quietly. "The week before he died. I left the number on a voicemail with his assistant. I figured if the letter hadn't reached him, the message would. He must have written it down before someone took it off his desk." Catherine looked at the ink strike scars on the page in her memory and understood finally who had crossed that number out and why. She asked him then why he had not come to her directly, from the start. He looked at her across the small table. The light from the window had gone soft and gold, the way late afternoon light does in old neighborhoods. "Because when I was Daniel Holt the first time," he said, "no one believed me until your father put his name behind mine. I didn't have a second Gerald Sloan this time. I didn't think you'd see it on your own." She said very quietly, "I almost didn't." "You did, though." She took the contract folder out of her bag and laid it on the table beside the letter. She had drafted it herself the night before in her father's handwriting, as much as her own. She had not asked legal to redline it. She did not want anyone else's fingerprints on the offer. He read it the way he read everything, line by line, his finger moving down the margin. When he got to the signature line, he uncapped the pen she handed him and signed his name in full, and beneath it in the lower right corner of the same page, he added the same shorthand initials that sat on the napkin, and the original blueprints, and the bottom of every piece of design work he had ever produced for Apex Racing. He looked up at her, with the pen still in his hand. There was one thing not in the contract, he said. He wanted it added by hand. She slid the page back to him. He wrote a single line above the signature block. "Tyler Reeves to receive a full technical briefing on the RS7 platform before the next race. He deserves to know what he's driving." He set the pen down and pushed the page back across the table. She read it, nodded once, and signed her own name beneath his. Daniel walked back into Apex Racing 2 days later, through the front entrance for the first time in 10 years. The revolving door turned cleanly under his hand. The lobby attendant looked up, hesitated for a half-second, over a face that had been on a maintenance roster the week before, and then read the badge on his lapel and straightened in her chair. The badge was new, printed that morning. It carried a title that had been factually true for a decade, and had only just been rendered in ink. Daniel Holt, Chief Design Engineer. Ray was waiting at the foot of the lobby stairs with 2 paper cups of coffee. He did not say anything. He held one of the cups out at chest height and gave a small, slow nod, his second nod, this one, in clean morning daylight rather than the blue cold of the upper bay at 6:47. Daniel took the cup. The 2 men walked toward the elevator side by side, and somewhere between the security desk and the chrome doors, a long silence that had been held between them for 10 years quietly let itself out. Nathan was at the elevator before the doors opened. He had a stack of folders against his chest and 17 questions written down in his head, and when he saw the badge, he opened with the first one before Daniel was fully out of the car. "All of them," Daniel said. "I've got all day." Tyler came up the corridor a few minutes later, not yet in his racing suit, a gym bag still over one shoulder. He stopped when he saw Daniel. Someone, probably Ray, had told him already. He set the bag down and walked over with his hand, out the open, easy hand, of a young man who did not yet know how to carry the thing he had been handed at 24. Daniel stood up from the drafting bench and shook it. For the first time since Tyler had signed his contract, the 2 of them stood looking at each other at the same height. "There are some things you need to know about your car," Daniel said. Up on the 15th floor, Catherine stood at the window of the office she had begun finally to occupy. The morning light came in over her father's old desk and fell across the leather notebook, which she had moved to the corner where she could see it. Down on the workshop floor, 3 stories below 3 figures were bent together over a fresh stack of drawings. She watched them for a while. The email had come in just before 9. The largest motorsports organization in the country had been watching Sunday's race. They wanted to discuss a technical partnership. They wanted to know who exactly had quietly fixed a car the rest of the industry had written off. She typed a single line of reply. "Our design team is in the middle of being rebuilt. Give us a little time." She sent it and turned back toward the window. Out in the workshop, Daniel's hand had come to rest on the engine cowling of the RS-7 again, and for the first time in 10 years, the sound of that car under his palm was the sound it had been built to make. Steady. Certain. A long, even note in a building that had finally remembered what it was for.